I made this computer desk for a family member. In comparison to the one I made last year at the start of the pandemic, you can see that last year's version was not quite square. There's a big gap there, but in the new one, a gap can hardly be seen. First, I started off by buying 5 pieces of 2x3x6 lumber. Then I proceeded to set up my table here that I made off camera some time ago. The legs are foldable, which makes for easy storage underneath the bed. Here I'm using spring clamps to make it a little bit more stable. Next, measuring the dimensions and cutting the boards. For this desk, I decided to use a half-lap joint. The one I made previously used just screws and butt joints. The first method I used for making these dados for the half-lap joints was to take my skill saw and make multiple passes and then use my hammer to break up those passes and then clean them up with a chisel. It was time consuming. Giving a little test fit here. Since that method was very time consuming, I decided to mount my circular saw on the underside of my table and use a piece of scrap plywood for a fence. So I measured the distance that I needed for these dados at the ends and I made multiple passes, just freehanding it, pushing it along. Normally, that is not recommended, but since this isn't a true cut and it's only a half lap cut, then it is okay. A true cut is when the blade will cut entirely through the stock, through the wood. But since that's not the case here, as I said, then it is acceptable. Even though it is acceptable, it is not recommended. As you see in this clip here, there's a little bit of kickback still associated with that because not using a sled, my hand is not parallel to the blade. And so at that instance, you see that I actually had my hand a little twisted at an angle, and that's where the kickback came from because it binded the blade. Nonetheless, after making multiple passes using my improvised table saw, I still used my hammer to knock out the little slices, and then I passed the wood over the blade to clean up the ridges so that it was nice and smooth. At this point, I had had enough of making dados and grooves for these half lap joints. So I said I would just use butt joints for the next piece. So now I'm assembling using glue and clamps. And in comparison to more recent projects, thankfully things are a lot more square. After a good night's sleep though, I realized I didn't have to do all that work to make those dados for the half lap joints. I could have just used the jigsaw instead, and that made things so much easier. So here you see me using the cross pieces to mark out where I'm going to make the half lap joints in the front and back frames that were already made. The jigsaw is much quicker and makes much less sawdust. Why didn't I think of this before? Next, I'm measuring where to make the half lap joints on the cross pieces. And at this point, I thought I was getting a really good shot of me cutting using the jigsaw, but instead, all you're seeing is just my ear and the sawdust on my back. So yeah, enjoy that shot. So the problem is, in that dimension, the board is too long for my jigsaw, so it didn't cut all the way through. So what I had to do was, I had to flip over the board and then finish the cut on the other end. After doing the first one by flipping over the board, I instead decided to flip over the jigsaw. because why not? After all, motion is relative. These protruding parts of the half-lap joints near the tops need to be cut off using my flush cut saw. If they are not cut off, then the plywood will not sit flush on top of it. It will be off at an angle. Now it's time to cut the plywood for the top shelf and the bottom shelf. Here I set up my level as a straight edge guide by clamping it to the plywood. Then it's to cut it down to size. And as always, you have to remember to be careful, or else a piece of plywood just might fall on your big toe. To get the plywood to fit flush, I'm using the front frame as a guide for where I will need to cut off corner rectangles. Then it's just a job of using the jigsaw to do the cutting. This piece only needs 2 corners cut off though, because it's the top shelf. And here I am struggling with the assembly until my faithful assistant comes to help me. And the last thing is to bore holes for the wheels. At first, the bit I used was not wide enough, so then I had to use a wider bit. And there you have it.